Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you so much for taking out, some really precious time from your evenings to join this workshop. I think the interesting thing about workshops like this is if you're a parent who has made time out to come and join, it is very likely that you are the kind of parent that's doing, everything right already, and who's really trying your best. But I'm really glad that we've got the opportunity to sit together and just to reflect on how unusual a year it's been, how challenging a year it's been for parents, and what we can do as parents to try and continually grow those connections between us and our children. It would be super helpful if I could get an idea of how old your children are. So if you could just type in the chat box, the answers will only come to the hosts. But if you can type in the chat box, it would be so good to know if most of you have younger kids or most of you have teenagers. I've got some 8, 7, 4. 8 is a very comfortable number for me because my own children are 8 and 6. So similar age. Here we've got 6, 10, we've got 13, 9, 5, 7, 5, 2.5, 3. Oh, mashallah, an 8-month-old baby. Amazing. I love that you're thinking about parenting so, in such an early stage. And that's fantastic because of what we're going to learn today about how important the early years are. 6 and 12, amazing. Such a fantastic range of ages. So lots of the things that I'm going to say probably, if I'm being honest, may have a bias towards the younger age group, just because in counseling and therapy, that is sometimes the age group that's really focused on, like the very early years. And it's also my area of more personal experience. But inshallah, most of the lessons that we'll discuss together will be completely relevant, whatever age your child is, even if they're an adult. So let me now try and share my screen, and inshallah we'll begin. Okay. So I've named the workshop today The Science of Parenting, but part of that was meant to be sort of an ironic thing, because although there is a lot of science to parenting, I believe that parenting really very much is an imperfect science. And in many ways, it's an art, and it's something that is going to be very different for every different family. And today, the idea is to just, as I said, sit together as parents, just so aware of our intention to all do the best for our children. We're going to take a little bit of time to reflect on our own experiences of being parented and how that may affect us in our parenting journey. We're going to think about a little bit of the science of parenting, and then just share some like golden nuggets that I've picked up on the way about parenting. As Sister Ruqayya said, my professional background is that I'm a GP and I'm very interested in pediatrics and child and adolescent mental health. I'm also a parent of 2 young children, and I'm a proud imperfect parent. So I think there's no such thing as a perfect parent. And I think that so much of the learning we have does come from where we do make our own mistakes. I was trained as a child counselor, specifically in arts-based therapies with children. And I think that's probably where most of my interest in parenting came from. When you do a counseling course, there's so much focus on your own personal experiences and your own personal childhood experiences. It really gets you reflecting. And that was the first activity that I wanted to do with you today. So let me see if I'm going to be able to get the tech right for this bit. But the first thing I want everyone to do is to really think about how you were parented. So thinking back to your childhood, which for some of us will be very far away, and for others will be a much more recent phenomenon. Think about your childhood and think about some of the experiences that really stuck with you in terms of how you experience parenting. I know that in Islam, there is such a huge emphasis on gratitude and thanks to our parents. And that is always at the foremost of our mind. You know, we always pray for our parents. We always say, "My Lord, have mercy upon them as they brought me up when I was small." But nevertheless, it's important to realize and acknowledge that lots of our experiences as children will affect us as parents. And in some cases, there may be some, points where we would do things differently, or we would want to reflect upon how we were parented. So what I'd like everyone to do, you can do this on the same device or on a different device, is to go to menti.com. You can see it on the screen. 62 25 49 3, and write a few words that summarize your experience of being parented as a child. Okay, I'm going to give everyone a few moments to do that, and then we're going to share our answers together. It's completely anonymous. No one's going to know what you wrote, so please do feel free. Okay, so everybody start going on to the more we have, the more interesting the word cloud is going to be. Oh, lots more. Oh, wow. Okay, so strong gender roles. That's an interesting one. Strict, driven to achieve. We've also got some really interesting ones. Fear-based, discipline, protective, big emphasis on respect, conservative, love. This is such an interesting word cloud, much more interesting than I expected it to be, actually. Academic focused. Loving is in the middle, which is beautiful. Loving and conservative and disciplined and strict and respect. We've got yelling. We've got harsh love. We've got sometimes ignored. And what I'm really finding interesting is, despite lots in there, some of which can be thought of as really positive and some of which can be thought of as not so positive, in the middle very much is loving. And what that tells me is that no matter what our parents tried, what they did, the different approaches they have, some of which may not be the same approaches we would have these days, very much always the intention was love and was loving. One of the reasons why it's so important to think about your own parenting is because you will carry that with you, as I said, with your own children. Sometimes it's really uncomfortable to think about our own past, especially if there were things there that maybe you were not so happy about. But I recently came across this wardrobe analogy and I absolutely love it. What it says is that our memories are like this laundry cupboard. I'm sure we all have these cupboards in our house, which are just stuffed with pillowcases and duvet cases and towels and everything. And they can be really, really messy. And because they're really messy, we don't want to open it. And if we open it, everything falls out and we just like stuff everything back in and close the door again. But when you actually talk about your memories and you think about your previous experiences, it's like you're taking everything out of that cupboard, you're folding it neatly, and then you're putting it back in. So you're not sort of forgetting anything. You're not ignoring anything, but what you are doing is just processing all your memory and all your thinking so that you're able to move forward in a much more constructive way. So a little bit now, we're going to talk about the science of parenting, and then we're going to think about some techniques that I've picked up on the way, which I found personally and professionally super useful. You would be absolutely amazed if you were to know just how immature the newborn baby's brain is. So humans are actually the most immature creatures when they're born. You've seen photos of like elephants and horses. As soon as they're born, within minutes, they're up and they're walking and they can be independent. whereas the human baby is actually the most dependent creature. Then in the first few years, up to the age of 5, but very, very much between the age of 0 and 2, you have this rapid growth of all the nerves and the neurons in the brain, hugely rapid growth. The brain grows and grows at a huge rate, such that in the beginning, when you're born, your brain weighs only a quarter of its adult weight, but by the age of 2, it already weighs 3/4 of its adult weight. So that huge growth happens in the first 2 years. You're having lots of nerves growing, but then what's also happening, and the really important bit, is that you're getting nerves connecting with each other. And where two nerves connect, we call that a synapse. And all these nerves are connecting, and they're connecting based on your experiences. Some nerves are connecting, and because the same experience happens again and again, that connection becomes stronger and stronger. And some areas, the connections aren't happening because those experiences aren't taking place. So the connections there may not be as strong at all. What we are essentially doing in the first few years of our child's life is growing their brain and growing and refining all the connections that are then going to really affect and influence everything and how they act in the future. So for example, if a baby knows that every time it cries, a loving mum is going to, or a loving dad is going to pick it up and respond to it and calm it down, that baby is going to grow up to become a child and then an adult who knows that when they are stressed, they can ask for help and that other humans will help them. Okay, that's a super important sort of skill to develop. That's because the connection between I'm stressed and other people love me and care about me will have been made. Similarly, if someone has connections made which are every time I'm distressed, I'm going to be left alone to cry, again, that person's going to grow up to become someone who maybe does not share their feelings, who may be a bit suspicious or worried about other people, who may have relationships where they don't share and where they never feel completely, heard or felt or loved. So lots of the brain is born in a way that's very immature. And in the first few years, you really, really start to develop lots of those connections. The brain itself is not completely actually formed and matured until the age of about 21 to 24. So this process takes a hugely long time. And if you look at these simple images of the brain, there's what we call the Triune brain theory, which is that essentially our brain is 3 brains. We have the really, really primitive, like lizard or reptilian brain, by which I'm not really referring to evolution, but what I'm referring to is the fact that these are brain structures that are shared by all creatures. And these are the brain structures which are really primitive and which are just, involved in processes like fear and fight or flight and running away and being scared. Then you have your limbic system, which is sometimes called the mammalian brain. And that's the brain which is more involved in emotions and in memories. And then you have the neocortex, the prefrontal cortex. This is the most developed part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that only develops much later on in life. And that's the brain which helps you with, your thought and your rationalization and being logical. And these three parts of your brain, that's almost the order that they develop in, such that when a baby is born, their reptilian brain's already fully formed. A baby knows how to cry, a baby knows how to eat, a baby knows when to be scared. But the other processes only come online later on, okay? Sometimes, and you'll hear this, if your children are in school, this is one of the things that they may be taught. The lower emotional brains are called the downstairs brain, and the upper sort of prefrontal cortex thinking brain is called the upstairs brain. And there's very much this theory that when you're really, really, really emotional, having a tantrum or being really sort of like intensely emotionally activated, you're not really thinking at that time. And so we're going to touch on that later, but we're going to talk about how it's important to connect and calm the emotions before we try and correct any behaviors. This is an image, again, from looking at those synapses, those connections between the neurons, and again, how you're born with a brain that has very little connection between all the different neurons. And as you grow, they increase and then they're pruned and they're refined until you end up with the personality and the, the processes in the brain that you have as an adult. And it's, I guess, interesting or important to mention at this point that, for example, mental health issues in adults, more than half of them, if we look at adults who have mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, etc., more than half of those would have started before the age of 14. So lots and lots of our, the early development of our brain really does have a long-term impact on us as adults. This is an image which is quite popular online, and there is some disputing about whether or not it's completely accurate. However, there is a reference that is from the Child Trauma Academy led by this Bruce Perry, Dr. Bruce Perry. And it's a very gross image of, by which I mean like a large and not detailed image of two brains, showing you that in extreme cases, and we are talking about extreme cases, we're talking about children who are brought up, for example, in extreme neglect in orphanages, these brain processes that we're talking about may be large enough to actually change the structure of their brain, such that the brain of a child who's really, really neglected will maybe look very different to the brain of a child who has been nourished and loved. Just going to have a quick look to make sure that we're not missing anything in the chat, and then we'll carry on. Okay. Now, why is this also important, and what does this mean to us as mothers? Lots of our knowledge of parenting comes from observing babies and mothers in what are called infant observation studies. Lots of our knowledge about parenting has actually come from studying really extreme cases, such as I told you, children who've been brought up in orphanages or children who've completely been neglected. And some of our information about parenting comes from monkey studies. And there was a gentleman called Harry Harlow in the 40s and 50s who did lots of studies on monkeys, who are, of course, much simpler creatures than ourselves, but nevertheless taught us some really interesting things. In one of the studies, monkeys were given two options, okay? They were given either they were taken away from their natural monkey mummy, and they were given two options. There was a mummy that was a wire net. You can see the picture, wire net, just metal net, but it had milk. It had like a bottle of milk in it to give them a baby monkey. And there was another monkey, which was covered in a soft, fluffy cloth, but did not have milk or any nutrition with it. And you'd be surprised to think that even though we think of animals as being so driven by their hunger and their thirst and their, their really basic instincts, the baby monkeys actually preferred the mum that was soft and fluffy, even though she didn't have any milk to give them. Okay. What this tells us is that affection and emotional warmth is one of the most important roles of parenting. Okay. Of course, as parents, we need to provide food, water, housing. We need to provide education. We need to provide security. All of these things are important for our role as parents. But one of the most important roles is that role of building a child's self-esteem, building their confidence and giving them that affection and that love. It was also found that those monkeys that were deprived of mothers, when they grew up, they were actually much less able to cope with stress. And interestingly, lots of those monkeys started showing behaviors where they would like scratch themselves until they bled themselves. They were showing self-harming behaviors because they were finding it so difficult to cope without having someone there who could calm them and who teaches them what it's like to be distressed, but then to be calmed down. You see, distress is a very normal part of life. And none of us will be able to go through life without experiencing distress at multiple points. But the important thing is that children grow up knowing that no matter how distressing life can be, there will be someone there to hold them along the way. I'm going to come back to the slides I've just missed, but I just wanted to show you this. It's an analogy I use really often, especially when we've been developing the workshops for orphan children in Iraq, where you're speaking to their mothers who are often very young and who have lost their husbands at a very young age. So you can imagine how difficult a situation that is. We say, honestly, life is like a roller coaster. Like, can you imagine like a roller coaster? On a roller coaster, you go upside down. You are hurtled across metal at huge speeds. And it's essentially an incredibly dangerous thing to do, to go on a roller coaster, except that you have a seatbelt holding you tight. And that seatbelt holds you so tight that it not only makes the roller coaster a safe experience, it makes the roller coaster an enjoyable experience. And so no matter what difficulties we may be going through, we all have very different circumstances. Some of us, like for example, for one, we're all living through a global pandemic at the moment. For another, there may be some amongst us who may be parenting single-handed, or who may be, going through real difficulties, maybe have lost members of the family, or maybe have, family breakup, or have lots of difficult things going on. If you have a parent who is holding you along that journey, then no matter how difficult that journey is, you will manage to survive, okay? And the other thing is, all you need is at least one very emotionally available adult in a child's life to be able to ensure that they get through okay. And that has been based on studies where they've looked at children who are super vulnerable and their outcomes. And even when you have a group of children who've all been through real difficulties, some of them may end up doing quite well in life, and some of them may end up really suffering. And the difference between them was having someone that they could rely on emotionally, at least one person. That's why in this parenting talk today, I'm not really going to talk about routines, schedules, gold stars, charts, or anything like that. The only thing I'm really going to focus on today is that emotional attachment. Okay. And here, if we quickly go back to this slide, this is very much in keeping with what I was previously saying about those neural connections. But it's something that many of you may have heard of and some of you may know quite a lot about. It's called attachment theory. And it's the idea that a child's relationship with their parents, and the relationship that has been studied most is the relationship with the mother, although both relationships are incredibly important. A child's relationship with their parent it becomes like the blueprint, the child's program for their future relationships in life, okay? So the child that's had a really secure, loving, dependable relationship with their mother and their parents will usually go on to have that with other people in life. And the child who's had difficulty, whose mother was sometimes there and sometimes wasn't, for example, that's called an anxious or an ambivalent relationship. Those children often grow up to feel quite insecure. Children whose relationships were avoidant, that's where emotions were not discussed, where things were super strict, where we just didn't talk about things together. They may also grow up to be a little bit emotionally cut off. Now, the thing to say about all of this, and this is a really important thing to say, is that this is why I was talking about the wardrobe before. When we hear about all of this, like attachment styles and the neural connections and all of this, it can sometimes make us feel a little bit panicky. That's definitely how I felt for lots of my counseling course. You start to feel a little bit panicky, wondering whether you've done everything correct on the way, whether there was anything you have done that's going to now jeopardize your children's future mental health and their relationships and their brain. But the truth is that there's no such thing as perfect parenting. And, you know, the work of Winnicott and lots of psychoanalysts has shown that all you need is good enough parenting. You need consistent and good enough parenting. And you don't need perfect parenting. And so it's to know that there's so much resilience built into that system. And there's nothing, it's never too late to rectify anything. Okay. And there's a question here about, in the chat about, can this impact be reversed? For example, if you've not comforted a baby, can this be rectified later? Well, you know, in most cases, yes, of course, and it depends. So when we're talking about those cases, for example, the children in the orphanages, we're not talking about a baby whose mum, like once or twice, was too busy and therefore let the baby cry for a little bit of time. We're not talking about that. We're talking about like consistently neglectful parenting, okay, or consistently neglectful rearing of a child. That is more difficult to reverse. But in our interactions where, you know, sometimes you have a good day, sometimes you have a bad day, sometimes things are difficult, sometimes things are okay. Yes, there is a lot of scope for rectifying there. And there's something called rupture and repair, which we'll talk about in a moment. Having a quick look. This another comment. This is interesting because so many people suggest that you should let a baby cry, otherwise they'll become spoiled. Again, such a common thing, I remember this being told to me so much when I had a young baby. You can't spoil a baby, okay? You just can't spoil them, and you can't spoil them by giving them love. Like, love is one of those things that the more you give, the better, okay? You're not going to spoil a baby. All you're going to do is you're going to teach that baby that when they are distressed, there is someone there to help them, okay? And, you know, how I thought of it was like, yes, sometimes those babies that are always carried and who may sleep in your bed and who you might never let them cry, maybe they'll become a little bit, you know, the word clingy is used, but that's sometimes what we aim for in our teenagers. Like, you know, when our children are babies, we don't want them to be clingy, but when they're teenagers, we do want them to always be at home and to talk to us about everything. And I think, you know, developing that attachment with your child, whilst it may be tiring for you in the beginning, inshallah, is going to end up being very fruitful in the future, where that child knows that if anything's going on, they can come and talk to you, and they know that you're a safe person, and they know that you'll always be there to listen to them. And they'll know that every other time they were hurt, they could rely on you. So inshallah, they will rely on you this time as well. Okay. Just before we move on to like tips, a few tips and tricks, I wanted everyone to just have a think, like have a moment of reflection about what is your parenting goal. I've put a picture up here of the Oxford and Cambridge boat race because I recently heard a story, which was the Cambridge once had a very successful coach. And the reason he was successful was he didn't really tell them what to do. But what he told them was, with every time they asked him something like, can we go out tonight? Or can we have, like, for example, this particular meal tonight? Or can we not train tonight, etc. Anything they asked him, he would say, will that help us win against Oxford? Okay, that was always his answer. Like to everything, it was, will that help us win against Oxford? Because the only aim he had as a coach was to win against Oxford. So every single action he wanted himself or his team to do was to work to that goal. So my reflection now is, what is that question for you? Like, what is the one thing you want from your child or from your family? If you want to write it in the chat, you can, but you don't need to. And it's certainly a question that probably will take quite a lot of time to think about. I'm just having a quick look. So yeah, I think about what that question is to you. Sometimes, and the reason I found this an interesting question, because I thought sometimes we live our life thinking, is this going to get my child into the best school? Is this, is this going to get my child into the best university? Is this going to help my child, I don't know, get a job in X, Y, and Z? And I think, is that the aim that you have for your child? Don't look at it on a day-to-day basis, or a week-to-week, or month-to-month, or year-to-year basis. Think, what is it that you actually want from your child? Like, is it closeness to Allah? Is it for them to become a really productive and inspirational human being? Is it for them to grow up to increase the amount of good and love in this world? What is it? Because that will really guide a lot of your parenting choices. MashaAllah, I've got here, for them to succeed in this life and the next. That's a beautiful one. I love that. I love that you've got this life and the next. One here, will this help you in your GCSEs? That's definitely a good one, but maybe a little bit time limited, because, what happens after the GCSEs, and what are the GCSEs aiming for? Here, a happy faith-based life. Someone's got, so they become God-conscious adults. Beautiful. Whatever it is, and I definitely still want to reflect upon mine. I think we should take time to really reflect on that one question that we can use to guide ourselves through life and through parenting, to really just have it somewhere prominent so that we can always be brought back to it. Okay. And again, just another message, because this is going to always be my message to you, which is that there is no way to be a perfect parent. We are not ma'sumin. There's no way to be a perfect parent, but there are a million ways to be a good parent. And we're going to discuss some of them right now. We saw in that word cloud in the beginning, there was, in our parents' generation, and maybe even before them, there was a huge emphasis on respect, like respecting your parents, okay, respecting elders, respecting adults. And there was, sometimes it was a little bit strict, sometimes it was a little bit culture-based. Respect is still highly important, and respect is still something that is absolutely relevant nowadays. But I'd put it to you that for children to respect adults, children themselves need to feel respected. And my favorite story, my favorite story about Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is that apparently once a parent, parents would take their children to the Prophet so that he would, like, that they would receive blessings from him. And so parents had taken their young son to the Prophet, and the Prophet was holding him. And just imagine this scenario, that you've handed over your son to the Prophet, and the son passed water on the Prophet. Okay, like, imagine your child doing that on the rug at home, let alone your child doing that near the Prophet. Okay, the parents became really embarrassed and started scolding the child, as you could imagine would be the case. And the Prophet said, ask them not to do that. And he said, because this could be washed away easily, but the damage or the hurt that you would cause this child by shouting at them in that way can't be washed away. Okay, so I absolutely love that story. And I love that, sometimes we think of respecting children as being a really modern phenomenon, but it's not, because there it was 1,400 years ago with our Prophet teaching us this basis. So I would say that a huge, if there was one thing to take away, it would be to respect children. They're incredibly important humans, and there's nothing just due to their size that, would mean that there's any reason why respect should be reduced. Respecting children will take us really, really far. The other The other thing that I was thinking about how to structure this talk, and I was thinking about all the different ways to structure it. And I thought, I don't want it to be so overly structured. I just have, through doing the counseling course, through doing different parenting courses myself, have come across such good tips. And I just thought to share them, even if it did seem to be not particularly connected. But I think so many of these are really things that have been quite life-changing for me, and I hope that they may have benefit to others. Take the opportunity to really connect deeply and regularly with your children. Thinking of your child as like this pot or this bottle or this vessel, and the more you can pour into them, the more they'll have, okay? The more confidence, the more self-esteem, the more love, the more, the more value you can bring them, the more they will then carry on with them. Like in the same way that we, think how to enrich, be it our bank accounts or be it anything else, and how to always top that up, then always be thinking if there are little top ups you can do to your child's sense of value and self-esteem. Really good ones there are things like one-to-one time, spending time one-to-one with your children, which is difficult if you have many children. But definitely, I only have two, but I've noticed that the quality of time, if I take one of them at a time and spend time with them alone, is very different to when you're spending time with both of them together, because you have the sibling rivalry come in, you have your attention being divided. So that one-to-one time is really, really special. Having really following their interests. So we all know that children can sometimes be, interested in very, very random things. And some of those things are of completely no interest to us, okay? Like I find this graph so funny about periods in your life when you know the most about dinosaurs, and how if you've got a 4-year-old child, you will know more about dinosaurs than someone who has a degree in dinosaurs, okay? Like most mums who have a child of that age will suddenly know so much about dinosaurs. And that's so sweet because you're meeting your child's interest, even though it may not be an interest you share. Meeting your child's energy, that's a really important one. Children are so energetic, they're bubbling the whole time. And one trick that they taught us in counseling skills is meet someone's energy. And that's just such a good conversation tip. Like if a child's super excited, if you respond to them and you're like being really mature and normal and sensible, they're going to take that as you're not interested. So meet them at their energy level. It's a really great tip for getting them to be really to feel that you're really interested in them. And again, when you're listening, when you're giving that one-to-one time, to really be present, to be listening to them with your ears, but also with your eyes and with your heart. And I find listening is so difficult now that we've got our phones pinging every second, diverting our attention, even if it's just that for a microsecond, it affects that quality of that connection. So listening, I think, is a skill that's so difficult, but so useful. And, nobody can do this all the time. So it's just about giving those few minutes a day of real undivided attention. Have you guys, have you heard of the love languages? This is if you Google, you will find that there are love languages quizzes that you can do for children. And the love languages is essentially this idea that people feel loved in very different ways. So some people really need gifts. Some people really need quality time to be loved. Some people really need words. Some people really need acts of service. And sometimes if it's not completely matched, it won't feel so loving for that person. So again, with my children, for example, one of them, the language of love is very much gifts and physical touch, which may not be my language of love, for example. It may not be my natural way of showing love, but now that I know that's their language of love, it's really important to express love to them in the way that they like and that they appreciate, so that they feel it. Because, for example, for someone whose language of love isn't acts of service, you'll never realize that all the acts of service that are being done for you are actually an expression of love. So love languages works really well in relationships, It also works really well for children. Again, we go back to that concept of the filling the self-esteem jar that your children have. And they say that your children, like what a baby needs, they say this about babies, but I think it's about everyone. It's like what a baby needs is that when they look at you, they can see that you look delighted to be with them. Okay, like, and it's true. When you see a baby and you're delighted and your face lights up, like, can you imagine what that does for the baby's sense of how special they are as a human? And that continues. You know, every time we show that love and that interest in our child, they will pack it away into their little, you know, their little self-esteem center. And I really think that this world, you know, the world is a harsh place, and they're not going to get that from everywhere. You know, our children are not going to get that from everywhere, be it because of like bullying at school, be it because they may have differences, be it because they may, you know, they may be interested in things that are really different to others. They're not going to always get this, they're not going to get their self-esteem easily from outside of the home. So as much as we can give it to them inside the home, then why not? It's the most beautiful investment we can make. I'm just going to have a quick look at the chat room. At what age does a child develop their love language, or can a love language be identified? That's such a good question. I don't know that there's an exact number, but what I do know is that with the quiz, I think you can do it for a child from about the age of 4 or 5, and you'll get a really good answer. Here, another thing is, another sort of guiding principle, one that I've really taken to heart, is connect before you correct, okay? Again, when we looked at our word bubble, punishment was on there. And certainly it was a theme, I think, for many of us, that, you know, there was right, there was wrong. And if you did wrong, you got punished. And if you did right, you got a star. Like, punishment hasn't been shown to work. And what's been shown more to work is just really understanding why the behavior happened. So if a child does something wrong, and if they are really upset about it, you have, because they're going to be in that downstairs brain we spoke about, there is no way that they're going to be able to give you any answers, any explanations, or learn any lessons about what just happened. You need to wait until that has calmed down through connection, through being there, through your patience, through love, until they have calmed down and their top brain, their, you know, their upstairs brain, their prefrontal cortex has come back online. Only then can you teach the lesson. And I heard this thing from Sister Masuma Jaffer a few years ago, and it really stuck with me, was that if your child has ever, and this is maybe for older children, like teenagers, if your child has ever done something that is so wrong and so upsetting that you cannot, like you in that moment, cannot regulate how angry you feel, then just say, you know, I'm sorry, I just can't, you know, I can't cope with how unhappy I'm feeling right now about this. Can we just take a break and maybe talk about this later? And then talk about it at another time when you're both calmer. One of the big, again, concepts, again, be it in child therapy, be it in education, is that because children's, you know, their vocal and their verbal skills, and this by children, I mean all the way up, to be fair, even lots of adults, because we can't always explain our emotions or what's going on for us in words, it will come out through behavior, okay? So if at any time you realize your child is just behaving a little bit funny, there will be a reason. And our job at that moment is to dig into that reason. So one of the really good examples is anger. Anger is never a primary emotion. Like, nobody feels angry for no reason. Okay, there's always a reason behind it. That's why, in fact, anger management sort of classes and things like that are going out of fashion, because anger is never the problem in itself. You need to dig in and find out what's going on behind and underneath the anger. It's called the anger iceberg. So you see, with an iceberg, there's the bits that on top of the water and that you can obviously see. So you can obviously see that today your 8-year-old son is shouting and hitting his sister and not listening. There will be a reason. So shouting and getting angry at them for being angry isn't going to be the solution. The solution is going to be in sitting with them, connecting before you correct, taking that time to try and understand what's going on beneath the surface, and it will always come out. This is another concept. It's called the co-regulation of stress. And it's one of those beautiful concepts because it starts from when your child is a baby. So you know how when your child is a baby and they're crying, the baby is crying, they're crying, they're really, really, really distressed, okay? The mom's, like mom at that moment doesn't, 1 second. So in that moment, the mom stood, there we go. Okay. So baby is crying and super, super distressed. Okay. Mum does not then starts crying and becoming really, really, really distressed herself. Like that's not going to help that situation. The child is crying. They're the ones with big feelings at that moment. Mum might become anxious and worried in the beginning, but then she'll quickly calm herself down and calmly, quietly hold the baby, rock the baby, feed the baby, sway the baby, do whatever it is that you need to do with the baby until the baby calms down. And part of the reason the baby calms down is because they're in the presence of an adult who is calm, okay? That same concept continues to apply throughout life, even though most of us end up forgetting it. So you can never have two angry people at the same time. That will never work. So child does something wrong, parent starts shouting, child starts shouting, parent starts shouting. Like that situation will never resolve itself. Or similarly with, for example, two spouses, like husband and wife, shouty, like that's not going to resolve. There needs to be one person who's able to calm down until that situation passes over, and then is able with their calmness to calm the other person, okay? So take home message from that is if your child's having a tantrum, don't have a tantrum at the same time. Somebody mentioned previously about whether it was okay to make mistakes and whether you could rectify that. And that's this is like probably my favorite concept, which is that there was something called rupture and repair, which is that we are all going to make mistakes on a regular basis, like I would say on a daily basis. And everyone makes mistakes regularly. And noticing that and apologizing is more important than the mistake having never happened in the first place, okay? This was, for example, something that I had to completely learn from scratch, because I'm sure many of you know that when we were young, our parents would never have apologized to us. Like there's nothing that they could have done which would have meant that they later came and said sorry, okay? Maybe it's not that they would have never done anything wrong. It's just that the hierarchy of them being a parent and you being a child meant that no one was ever going to apologize to you, okay? So this isn't something that came naturally to me, but it's something that's been so liberating, you know? Like if I've ever lost my temper at one of the children for something that's pretty silly, which again, as I said, happens, then it's about going to them afterwards and saying, I'm really sorry, I lost my temper at you and I shouted, even though, you know, it wasn't your fault, or even though I shouldn't have acted that way. I'm really sorry. Can I make it up for you by giving you a hug now? And next time I'm going to try not to do that. By you apologizing, not only like have you said sorry, which is a big deal, but you've taught the child that it's okay to make mistakes in a loving relationship and to say sorry, and for the relationship to then go back to normal or to better than normal, okay? You've all seen these pots, these, I think they're Japanese pots, where when they break, they stick them back together with gold and they end up looking even better than before. And that's rupture and repair in a relationship. It's okay to say sorry, and noticing and saying sorry makes the relationship stronger than if the mistake hadn't even happened. Okay. I'm aware of time, so we're just going to spend just a minute or so on these slides, which is that we've spoken so much today about self-esteem and filling up your child's self-esteem bank. Okay. 1 second. Filling up your child's self-esteem bank. But it's important to know that that doesn't mean that we're just continuously praising our children. Okay. Praise is nice and it's good to get, but what's even more important than praise is to try and always develop that child a little bit extra. So for example, if your child comes and has drawn a picture and they're like, Mummy, do you like this picture? Our usual response is, oh, wow, yes, that's a beautiful picture. But instead, if we say something like, oh, that's an interesting picture. Do you like it? What do you like about it? Tell me more about it. In that way, we're teaching them to value themselves rather than always look to other people to value them, which, as we know as adults, is a super important skill. And growth mindset parenting is a really interesting thing to look into. And you can look into Big Life Journal online. They have lots of free resources for this. And the final slide of like a tip or topic before we move on to the summary is that of emotion coaching. I've mentioned it a little bit when I spoke about rupture and repair. But what emotion coaching essentially is that children learn through role modeling. So children need to see us coping with our emotions and talking about our emotions so that they are able to deal with them themselves, okay? So an example of emotion coaching would be if you found your child to be very angry, it would be naming that emotion and then helping them to try and work it out. So, oh, I can see that you're looking really angry. Is there anything I can do to help you with that right now? Like, should we sit down and do some deep breaths? Should we sit down and have a cuddle? What can I do to help? Like, what can I do to help you, feel a bit better? So that's like you talk them through that emotion. And that's also useful for you to do for yourself. For example, in the rupture and repair, like, I'm sorry, Mummy was angry. She was not feeling very calm. I've now noticed that, so I've come to say sorry. So just using those, like using every opportunity as a lesson to develop some growth. And I remember at one point, I had a friend who also has sons, and she said she loves behavior that, like, in inverted commas, because it's not a word we use, but like she loves naughty behavior because that is where you can teach. Like, if a child is behaving the whole time, there's nothing you're going to ever, there are no learning moments there. But when a child does something that isn't perfect, isn't great, that's where you really have the opportunity to teach. And that's why those moments are so special. And finally, all of this is really hard work. Like, we've just said so much. Like, we've just said how as parents, we're basically growing our child's brain, we're affecting their mental health, we're affecting their future relationships. There are a million and one things ideas about how to do that. That can seem really like a huge responsibility, which it is, and a huge, a bit stressful. And it's so important to look after yourselves first. It's such a huge metaphor. Everyone uses it now, but the one about putting your own oxygen mask before you can put oxygen on for others is really relevant. And I think especially in the context of a pandemic. We're going to have another session, which is called Pandemic Parenting, in which we're going to look much more into how we can support ourselves as parents, because I think that's really the key to parenting in a pandemic. But for now, just take that as, a really important message of self-care. And we will look at it more in the next session. And just to end off with, remember that, you know, what's your best discovery? Asked them all. That I'm enough as I am, said the boy. And just remember that good enough parenting is good enough, that nobody is perfect, no matter what it may seem. And that the fact that you are here and you're taking this time to grow as parents is a testament to the parents that you are. And inshallah, you'll have tawfiq to carry on that incredibly important role. It is now almost 9 o'clock, but I'm just going to have a quick look at the questions to see if there are any questions. If anyone has any burning questions, do write them in the chat. And if you need to leave, absolutely, it's fine to do that. If you want to stay for the questions, then you're more than welcome. Some people are asking if there's a recording. Yes, inshallah, I believe there will be. Sister Ruqayya can tell us about it. Hear about, someone's asking, what do you do when the child hates it, when you point out how they feel? What can you do instead? That's a really good one. Lots of us hate it. Like, I'm sure lots of us hate it when people point out how we feel. Like, oh, you look stressed today. I think part of it might just be about you practicing that on yourself in front of the child as well, to show them that that's really important, like talking about your own emotions, just making that language of emotions part of the language of your family. And then, you know, if they really hate it when they point out how you feel, maybe to do it in more subtle ways. So we don't need to be so obvious, like, oh, you look sad. Could just be, you know, oh, I've noticed that you're a bit quieter today. Sorry, I've noticed that you're a bit quieter today. You know, I'm interested in knowing what's been happening, or, you know, I'm wondering whether it could be that you're feeling sad. Those are called the WIN questions, WIN. Wonder, interested, and notice, WIN. It's 3 ways to basically subtly ask the same question that you were going to ask, but in a more subtle way. Let's have a quick look. Someone's asking about my daughter always talks negative and thinks negative. What should I do? I think there's a lot about growth mindset there that might be really, really useful. So if you were to search up the growth mindset, you know, it is difficult to get into that negative sort of cycle, but it's important, like, to just reframe the words, you know, like, it's okay to have negative emotions. We all feel that at times, but to reframe it, you know, like, for example, I can't do this, adding in the word yet at the end. So just, you know, teaching someone that I can't do this, adding in yet at the end just totally changes the sentence. Like, yes, of course you can't do this. You've never learned how to do it before, but maybe if we practice, you'll get there. Someone's got a question of how to show a child you trust them. I think by giving them the chance to do things and to make mistakes. So, you know, giving them the chance to do things, you know, like if they, you know, for example, the other day, my son wanted to hammer a nail into the wall, and I really didn't want him to do it because he might have damaged the wall. But it was about, you know, just deep breath, you know, doing this right now to him under supervision is going to be very important for him. So, and it's going to make him feel like he's, you know, very good at these things. So let me just let go and give him the chance to do it. And even, you know, it might go wrong, they might make a mistake, but giving people the chance to make mistakes and then to correct them is really important to build up trust. Someone's asking about, sometimes my son refuses to connect, like he wakes up in a bad mood, and I find that difficult to understand. With connection, it's not always talking, like especially based on the age of the child. Lots of children don't want to sit and talk. That's not their language. Lots of children want to connect through play. And sometimes it's going to be about getting down to their level and really asking them what they want to do and having a bit of really child-directed playtime and doing that on a regular basis. And you may find that there are things that change. And if it's always when he wakes up, if he always wakes up in a bad mood, I mean, he might just not be a morning person. I know a few of those. So it might be about connecting at a different time of day when, you know, they feel a little bit more conducive to that. Someone said, my son doesn't like to make mistakes, which stops him doing things. Yes, yes. Like, okay. So this is like a perfectionistic trait. And this is something that so many children have and so many adults have. Okay. So even, yeah, so many people have this. Okay. And growth mindset, again, is perfect for that. So really, really look into that. I think we need to start to celebrate making mistakes. I always say that Thomas Edison, who invented the light bulb, had to try 1,000 times before he got the light bulb correct. And if he had stopped after the first attempt, after the first time it went wrong, we wouldn't have light bulbs now. Mistakes are something that we need to start celebrating. This is something we've never been taught before. But for example, with these, you know, all these app developers in Silicon Valley and all these techie people, they celebrate failure and they believe in failing fast, which means try a lot of things, fail at lots of things, but fail quickly so that you know which ones are right and which ones are wrong and which ones you should pursue. So actually that ability to fail and to learn from that is a really, really important bit of resilience. Okay, I might just take one or two more. If they're really specific, then it might not be the place for it right now, but inshallah, you can connect with Sister Ruqayya about if you have any really specific questions. Sibling rivalry and bickering. I know. That's a really difficult one. Again, I think one of the things about siblings is that giving them time alone each day can be really helpful. You know, if you give your lots of sibling bickering is that they are trying to fight for the parents' attention. So giving them a little bit of their time by themselves every day is really helpful, which I know is so difficult if you've got lots of children, but is a really good investment to make, really, really magical investment to make. If anyone is interested in going really deep into these subjects, then there's Parenting by Connection, which you can look in on Instagram or online, which they run, Sister Shaheen Marali runs courses of about 6 sessions, which are really, really good. Okay. And maybe the last one I will take is, the last one I'm going to take, the last question I'm going to say is, how do we cope with young children hitting adults? I would say it depends how young the child is. If we're talking about a child who's like 1 or 2, then they may just really not understand that that's wrong. And I would just hold their hand and say no, like in a bit of a firm way, we do not hit, okay? Or like gentle hands. And I would repeat that every time that happens. So every time they did that, it would be no, gentle hands, we do not hit. And eventually hope that they just grow out of that behavior, because that for 1 and 2-year-olds, sometimes they do that and it's not badly intentioned. They're just so, like, as I said, their brains just haven't matured at that point at all. But if it was a child who was a bit older than that, then I think we definitely you'd want to have a chat about exactly why that was wrong. And one of the best ways to stop negative behavior is to completely ignore it. So for example, let's say if your son hit your daughter, it would be to completely ignore the son and to go to the daughter and to be like, are you okay? How can I help you? Come and sit on mommy's lap. Let me wipe it. Let me stroke it. Let me make you feel better. Giving her tons of attention for being the victim, rather than what we usually do, which is ignore the victim and go to the person who's just hurt the other and give them lots of attention, even though it's negative attention. Still, that children crave attention, be it negative or positive. They'd still rather someone be telling them off than someone be ignoring them. So actually, in that scenario, ignoring the person who's hit and moving to the person who's been hurt is a really quick way to extinguish that behavior. But if the child was much younger, then I'd probably just be a little bit firm but kind, but wait for that to outgrow. That's all we have time for today. And I don't want to take your time more because I know just how precious your evenings are. I'm really looking forward to the next session, inshallah.